Of course. So again, apologies for the coarse voice, but thanks to this device, the analog input, as I'm going to keep losing my voice, is going to be amplified through digital technology. So as my slides are coming up, I've been looking into fintech for a while now, and I sort of have a narrative for where fintech came about from. And one of the interesting unintended consequences of digital technologies moving into finance is that computer scientists have become monetary economists and financial economists. You can't talk to a computer scientist, and because their slides decks are always the nature of money. And I'm like, okay, I'm the economist, you're the computer scientist. I'm not putting up the slide object-oriented programming, am I? Successful businessmen become philosophers. This is not the first time that I'm encountering very successful businesses who launch startups, who've started approaching the world in a very philosophical sense. And economists are trying to become more and more technology-oriented because we find that we really need to understand this technology from the ground up. Otherwise, we don't know which assumptions to make, because otherwise you just sort of relabel things. So what I'll try to do here on this talk, which is a joint paper with Silvia Bartolucci, a postdoc at the center I launched at Imperial College, is talk a little bit about sort of selection of crypto assets. And we're going to approach it in a way that I think is going to be provocative, at least in a sense that I consider provocative. And it'll also take us back to sort of the economics, some of the economic principles of decades, if not a sort of a century ago. Because it turns out that you start looking at these technologies, you'll need to look at, you'll need to go back to the basics and ask for things. Are they still appropriate? So let me start with some definitions, the way I see things. Since the title of the talk is about crypto assets, the way that I'm going to think of a crypto asset here is an intangible, and I'll unroll it for you, digital asset whose issue and sale or transfer are secured by cryptography and shared electronically over a distributed ledger. A distributed ledger is going to be a database of issuance and transaction records. A picture here illustrates for you a proof of work type of distributed ledger, blockchain, where some of the transactions are selected for inclusion into the block and then validated that way through encryption technology. Each crypto asset has its own blockchain, supported potentially by its network of nodes. So what's interesting immediately about crypto assets is that a crypto asset is an asset, but no one's necessarily a liability. It could be an asset in someone's explicit liability, but it doesn't have to be. It makes the crypto assets in some way really quite a bit closer to commodities. You can think that commodities are nature's liability, but they're not on nature's balance sheet, right? So you can issue an asset, something that has asset-like characteristics, but no one is liable for it in a direct sense, right? So that makes this particular asset. This gives this particular asset very, very interesting features. Under the current standards, last time I looked, a crypto asset does not meet the definition of either cash or financial instrument because it does not represent a claim on any one specific balance sheet. Now, you can issue a token that represents a claim that's a liability to you that has to be covered by an asset, like say in the form of stablecoin, but you don't have to. You can also issue a claim for which you're not liable. It is just an asset. It has asset-like characteristics in that it is held in expectation of future economic gains, but it's not a liability. It will become important a little later on. So many of such assets have been issued. So here's a one representation of the asset ecosystem that I'm reproducing here under Creative Commons attribution. So you have types of assets that are Bitcoin and Bitcoin related, alternative coins, you have cross-border payment type of assets, you have tokens, you have platforms. So there are many, many different assets that are digitally native, they're held in expectation of future economic gains, and they cover, they have many features, they have many protocols, and many uses. So Sylvia and I started looking into it and thinking, well, can we actually reduce these assets into something where we can analyze them a little bit more concisely? And we started looking at it in the following way. So first of all, one of the interesting aspects of these assets, of crypto assets, is that successful adoption of them hinges on network effects, right? So here's a representation of from a paper on initial coin offerings. And what these authors have done is that they looked at Twitter following of different types of coins, and if there is no mention on Twitter then that's considered dead, because it no longer, nobody cares about it being there, right? So sort of important part of a network effect to an economist is that, and it will be embedded in the model, is that the network effect, and it's important, it's a purely demand-side phenomenon, okay? It's a demand-side phenomenon. It's not an informational phenomenon, it's not a friction phenomenon, it's not a transactions cost phenomenon, it's not a supply issue phenomenon. Demand-side. You gain from adopting something if wider adoption gives you that gain. That's demand-side phenomenon. The more demand for it there is, the more the more gain and expectation you're getting. Both, Haldarian, who is the chief economist of Google and the founder of Ethereum, have spoken on it and acknowledged that really, since the issuance of these crypto assets, they're issued on top of open source technology. Issuing another crypto asset on top of open source technology is basically marginal cost zero. So the ones that are going to be adopted will be adopted because of network externalities, because of some sort of a network effect, because of others are going to be adopting it. So here are the questions then we came up with. One question is, and here this is where we're a provocative economist sense, and are investors going to be making decisions about selection of crypto assets similarly to the way we think that they make decisions about existing assets that were not digitally native? They now exist potentially in a digital form, but or maybe not. Maybe the selection decision of these crypto assets is going to be really done quite differently. It may not be done based on the principles that we have before. For example, selection decisions of assets from an economist perspective typically come from some sort of a consumption utility type of framework in which you have a way to transfer value across time and states of the world, and the financial asset in that form, in that security, enables you to do so. And that's why it's selected. And then we mold it into particular into particular asset classes that enable us to do it in a way that whether they expire, whether they don't expire, which states of the world, what do they cover over which periods of time, and so forth. Which features of these, so we're questioning that. So we're also questioning which features of these intangible digital assets are going to drive demand choices. Is it going to be similar things to what we had before, or maybe something really quite different? We are putting that question, we're putting an open question mark on it. And which types of assets will survive and which will go extinct? So do we think that it's going to be something that adds characteristics, for example, to existing sort of digital type characteristics to existing assets, or is it going to be something completely different? I'm going to rephrase here and go a bit out on a limb, but if you think of what Pete is proposed in one way, is that you can think of that a stock can now be thought of as sort of a stock plus additional characteristics enabled by digital technology, which enables it to be split up into tiny, tiny pieces and make it much more of a sort of a fluid type of instrument as opposed to something that's much, much more discrete. And again, I'm reinterpreting something incorrectly from what he said, but in the spirit of you're adding, digital technology enables you to add features to the markets, to add features to the instruments, but the instruments sort of serve their goal. Or is it just going to be completely something different? Is it going to be in a digitally native way something that we haven't thought of before? All right, you excited so far? Now it's a time to start answering some of these questions in the remaining 10 minutes that I have. So our framework, the way we're going to formulate it is that we're going to look at the supply of crypto assets, and we're going to look at the demand for crypto assets. On the supply side, we're going to describe all crypto assets in terms of 2 dimensions. It's going to be a 2-dimensional grid. Why 2-dimensional? Because it fits on the slide. You can think of that some of the elements that we're missing from here, and we fully acknowledge that there are some elements that we're missing, are also something that would ask you for. Maybe it really needs to be more dimensions here. And there will be 2 dimensions that we're going to cover. We're going to parameterize them by variables normalized between 0 and 1. One we're going to call security, and the other we're going to call stability. So security is a technological vulnerability to risks of fraud, manipulation, abuse, and attack. We're talking about crypto assets now entirely, digitally native instruments held in expectation of future economic gains. So you can think of security as a cross-sectional attribute of assets. So they are cross-sectionally different in terms of how secure they are at the point in time. And the second element we're going to think of is stability, and that is vulnerability to risks associated to potentially faulty governance. And you can think of, for example, governance associated with formal laws and regulations, formal judicial system, as well as technological features such as a proof-of-work consensus mechanism. Right, so there's both consensus mechanism embedded in there, and the how well it's coded, how well it's policed, what kind of technology is associated with that. It's governance. So you can think of stability as a time series element. So the same digital asset could have a crypto asset, could have stability that varies over time, right? So depending. And that enables it to retain value over time. So they're parameterized by 2 variables, S and theta, S and psi, actually, rather. And for descriptive purposes, to sort of illustrate our views, we just sort of put names of more or less existing crypto assets out there to illustrate potentially what we have in mind. And you can think of low security, low stability as crypto tokens, high security, high stability as central bank digital currencies. So to illustrate, excuse me, security is technological vulnerability to risk. So in the case of paper money is becoming more and more secure. It is being printed on increasingly much more sophisticated type of medium. Different ways of protection are being introduced to have it secure. Some of these elements are not visible to a human eye. They require special technology to recognize. Stability, on the other hand, looks like this. This is the building of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. That's what makes that stable. Not security, not the features. I can put another one here. The actual security of the notes in circulation issued by the Central Bank of Venezuela actually dominates, according to some experts, the security features of the US dollar. But the Central Bank of Venezuela does not necessarily guarantee that that very secure piece of paper is going to remain stable over time. So demand for crypto assets, that's where the woomph is going to come from, because I told you that, oops, where did I go? That's because I told you that we're going to look at the network externality much more. So, and here is where the interesting part is. Please raise your hand if you know someone who used an online dating app. Really, someone, anyone. Please keep your hand up if that, not necessarily you, just someone, right? So please keep your hand up if you know that resulted in a stable relationship. Oh, very few hands went down. So the way we're going to model the adoption of these assets is in the form of an app. So our agents are going to be using an app-like technology to select crypto assets. Why do we think of it that way? Because we think that these, just like online dating apps, created possibilities and revealed preferences and were be able to lead to matches that were difficult to achieve before. For crypto assets, you can achieve similar results. You can now no longer need to be limited to your local bar to look for your mates. You no longer need to be limited to a particular language, to a particular set of customs, and so forth. So, however, the preferences need to be revealed, and that's sort of the interesting bit. So what we're going to do is that we're going to simulate investor-app interactions and monitor outcomes in terms of assets. We're going to look at two variables, and these two variables is adoption and expected returns. So we're financial economists after all. It's going to be an app that our agents are going to interact with. We call it Crinder, actually Cinder for Tinder. So we have a prototype in the making. So think of it again as a preference revealing mechanism in the space of digitally native assets. We actually, with crypto assets, we may hypothesize what these preferences are, and we can write down the model of what these preferences are. But if you ask me, I don't know. Like, I don't know what these preferences are. But if there is a way to reveal them, that would be good. As in any network type effect, if you studied network economics, it's typically studied high up in the PhD program. But if you studied it, typically preferences associated with network effects are going to have an aggregate sum somewhere. So there will be your preferences that incorporate something that the aggregate sum of preferences of all agents, right? Which means that your utility or your gains in some way are positively affected by the aggregate sum. The aggregate sum in our variable that we're going to have is going to be one of the global variables. So asset features, S and psi, on the supply side, we're going to assume they're N assets, feed into the feed into this environment. Agents select, each agent on the demand side is given the choice to select between two, and that's important, and that's what takes us back a long time ago. It's a binary choice. You're given two assets to select from, and you select one over the other. It's a simplification. It's an important simplification, but it's a simplification at this point. You can grill me on that. We're doing this for a reason. If you go all the way back to Arrow's work on that and the binary choices, you can very quickly arrive to central planned economies, dictatorial outcomes, and so forth. We're aware of that. Okay, we're aware of that. We know why we're doing what we're doing. So you're selecting between two assets, I and J, and you're saying yes to one and no to the other. The app learns from you and everybody else who makes selections and recommends to you based on your preferences, which are characterized by beta, which you actually enter into the app. You say what kind of security features you like, what kind of stability features you like, and what kind of total return you're looking to achieve on your based on your outcomes. So it's a recommender app. It's going to recommend things to you. It's going to say, if you like this, then you might prefer to do that. And it learns from everybody else. That's an important thing here, because the agents themselves don't necessarily have to be very clever. In a lot of things that we do in finance, agents have to solve very, very complicated systems of stochastic differential equations. At some point, you start asking yourself a question, really? So in our case, all that the agents do is make binary choices. And the app learns. So features feed into a global average. Each investor is going to compare two assets, increase adoption, decrease adoption. This is the probability of adopting an asset I over an asset J. It's going to have beta preferences over the total return, change in the total return associated with your decision, change in the security features, and change in the stability features between the two assets. We are going to update expected returns based on the change in adoption. Higher adoption means higher expected return plus noise. Noise, importantly, is centered on stability. So if something is not stable or less stable, but it increases expected returns, it's going to come in there as an error term. So, and what we've done that, it's not a Nash equilibrium model. We're not an equilibrium model of any sort, so we're not going to create an equilibrium for you. We could. We will need to make additional assumptions in order to build up an equilibrium composition here. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to simulate. And our question is, notice here that all the betas are equal to 1, which means that they're just normalized. So we're going to simulate. We're going to start with a bunch of assets, and we're going to see how many stable compositions of assets are going to appear. And these are going to be the compositions of assets. So this is the probability of not being adopted. Probability of not being adopted is 1 minus the probability of being adopted, right? So, and the expected return. And with a bunch of simulations, we could arrive at, with equal weights, we basically arrive to anywhere between 3 and 4 different types of crypto assets. So, and we call them, the central bank digital currencies. These are your cryptocurrencies in the middle, and highly speculative ones. These are crypto tokens. So 3 different stable configurations of assets. We can vary these betas. Once we vary these betas, we can arrive to potentially two different configurations of assets. We get to corner solutions. We get to situations where our agents, as they're selecting, are basically selecting between something really, really stable and really, really speculative. And, we can vary sort of changes in the ecosystem. We can change different types of distribution, and we can get tails. These are typically non-overlapping tails on where we are. We can change our investors. We can make them not be all the same. They could have different parameter betas. Once you get to heterogeneity more, again, you get to fewer clusters. You get to 2 clusters from 4 clusters. What does it give us at the end? The reason we decided to write this paper is that we'd like to open up this space for discussion and analysis a bit. Because we think that with this sort of way of, we think that the demand choices over these assets are going to be, are potentially going to be different. We also think that we are now in a position to actually look at some of these choices as preference-revealing type of exercises, because a lot of the things that we have done before in order to arrive at equilibrium solutions, we had to assume objective functions. And another thing that is exciting for us is that our agents could effectively be don't have to learn. The app is going to learn, but the agents don't necessarily have to learn. Agents just need to make choices. Why is this interesting and why is this important? Because I think that I'm a former regulator. I was a regulator during the global financial crisis. I was chief economist of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I was involved in a lot of things, and the regulatory push that is. And I can tell you this, that the regulations of human agents are becoming much, much more complex. Humans are becoming more protected with the technology, with the digital technologies coming their way in a variety of different layers. Now, there are a lot of things out there that are agents with computing power, but they're not human. Your phone has more computing power than the orbital station out there. Your car is a computer on wheels. There are a lot of things now that have computing power, distributed computing power, that we can actually give opportunities to make decisions, limited decisions, to engage in economic and financial transactions that are not going to be human agents. Now, for human agents, all of this stuff, all of these crypto assets is really complicated. It took me a long time to understand, to at least start gaining an understanding of the jargon and this, that, and the other, right? To computers, this crypto stuff is like candy. They love it. They love it. There's nothing better. They understand very long strings of letters and numbers that are unique to each other that goes through non-invertible hash function. To them, it's beautiful because it represents states, and computers are state machines. That's why it's difficult to express time for computers, because time for computers is really, really hard. States for computers is very, very easy, right? So for digital agents, crypto assets is probably where the future is. For human agents, yeah, I mean, you see these clusters, but I sort of see it more in the direction of, I'm involved a little bit with, I'm talking to a number of startups in artificial intelligence space and fintech space, and one of the startups, it's not the only one, it's not the first time I'm hearing this, is developing a solution for cars. Your car has a lot of computing power, and so I think by some estimates, a car is stationary 93% of the time. 7% of the time during its lifetime it's in motion, 93% of the time it's stationary. During the time that it's stationary, sometimes you have to pay for it. Moreover, during the time that it's stationary, all that computing power is useless, it just sits there, right? So your car has value, and it can engage in transactions for parking spaces, for cars, for exchange of computing power in a very sensible way. So what these people are developing is a way to have cars actually engage in periodic auctions to bid for parking spaces depending on characteristics that you embed in it. So it's actually included in the navigation system. You just tell the car where you want to be, and the car drives you there, and it bids for parking spaces to get you somewhere within the limits. You don't need to be involved. You don't need to be involved, right? So, I mean, the car can do it. It has enough computing power in it. It's a digital agent engaged in transactions using these tokens. How well it's going to work depends on network externalities. If all the cars or all the cars in a large jurisdiction use that, then your car will use it too, because there are network externalities from doing so. So a bit provocative for you, but I hope that makes you think about this future. And in the now.